Naomi Wolf, and I've been asked to do a webinar on what makes for an effective protest. I am really excited to be able to share research that I've done for a book I wrote called Give Me Liberty, which looked at how to open up a closing society and what's the most effective way to build democracy in the face of people or tyrants or systems who are trying to oppress and squelch citizens. I wrote Give Me Liberty as a sequel to The End of America, and The End of America was a roadmap to how oppressive forces, whether on the left or the right, do always the same things to try to close down democracy and suppress citizens' voices and steal the wealth and create a society based on fear, a closed society. So when I looked at the different times and places where citizens had been successful in opening up democracy again, I learned that the most powerful single tool citizen movements have is protest, but not any kind of protest, a very specific kind of protest. Some kinds of protest are ineffectual, and those are the kinds we've been encouraged to engage in for the last 20 years. And some kinds are unstoppable, and that's what I'll be telling you about in the next 45 minutes. The big thing to realize is that in the last 30 years, as a reaction to the very effective protests of the 60s and 70s, which really were powerful and brought about huge changes. You know, everything from the moratorium against the Vietnam War, which brought things to a standstill for a while, to the civil rights movement in the 60s, which lasted for years and was tremendously peacefully disruptive, to, you know, the occupation by the free speech movement of a park in Berkeley. The 60s and 70s were a time of tremendous effective protest, all of which is now illegal. Why is it illegal? Because the powers that be realized how effective this tool was and systematically went about secretly, municipality after municipality, creating restrictive permits that make sure that while you still technically have your First Amendment rights, and the First Amendment says that you're allowed freedom, that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, or the citizen's right peacefully to assemble to petition government for redress of grievances. So theoretically, you have First Amendment's right to do that, but in New York, because of restrictive permits, I can't read the Constitution out loud in Union Square, and in Washington Square I can't rally, and citizens can't use megaphones. So over-permiticization has effectively castrated our First Amendment rights across the country. So what citizens need to know, now that protest is waking up again, is that the First Amendment trumps everything. And even though in Madison they're telling you, oh, it's against permit rules for you to camp here, or in San Diego they're saying, well, you can march here till 10 o'clock at night and then you have to go home because of permits. This is all unconstitutional. And in 1925, the Supreme Court passed down a ruling that held that if a permit requirement by a municipality violates the Constitution, it's illegal. So I strongly urge movements to know that just because they say there's a permit against it doesn't make it the law of the land, and that what you should be doing is assembling in public and using your free speech rights and hiring, that is donating lots of money to your local CLU, to the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, or the Center for Constitutional Rights, so that lawyers can fight those battles municipality to municipality to gain back freedom of speech and assembly in practice, town after town. The other thing that's really important to realize going into a discussion about protest in America is for the last 30 years, protesters have been painted as, you know, these scruffy riffraff who are behaving in a really un-American disruptive way. Like Mayor Bloomberg tried to say, well, I'm trying to balance the right of people to protest with the right of citizens to be undisturbed. Don't buy into that. It's a false framework. There is no absolute right under the Constitution to be free of all disturbance from your fellow citizens' First Amendment activities. That right doesn't exist. But there is an absolute right to freedom of speech and assembly. So just because it's loud in Zuccotti Park doesn't mean it's up to the mayor. He doesn't have the right to balance our free speech rights against those of the people around us, as long as we're behaving in peacefully disruptive ways, right? There is, in a democracy, disruption goes along with some free speech activity. peaceful disruption. And I'll get to the importance of peaceful disruption in just a minute and what that looks like. But the last thing I want to say as a sort of broad theory before I get into the details of effective protest is, if people try to suggest that this is un-American, I need to remind everyone that the American Revolution was initiated through protests. The Tea Party was a protest, up and down the Eastern Seaboard when we were a colony of Great Britain and we were being oppressed. American citizens, well, not American citizens, British subjects living in America, engaged in very radical protest. They were, burning in effigy tax collectors, and they were, engaging in much more violent protest than I would ever. I believe in nonviolent protest, but our nation was founded in protest, and then even after the nation was established, there were protests up and down the Eastern Seaboard against Madison and against Washington and against Jefferson, against foreign policy, against monetary policy. And even though Jefferson and Madison and Washington didn't love being the targets of these protests, they understood that this was the system they put in place working, that this is what Americans are supposed to do, to redress grievances. It's the First Amendment, because everything else follows from that. It's the foundation of everything else. So when you protest and are peacefully disruptive, you're not just using a right, you're behaving like an American who's doing your duty. There is a duty to protest. And so what I'm going to give you now is 10 guidelines for how to have the most effective possible kind of protest. The number one thing you want to have always as your goal is not confrontation, not escalation. Those are bad. What you want to have is peaceful disruption of business as usual. And this is something that is very specific and takes a lot of discipline. It's very tempting, especially for young protesters, people who are really mad, to want to kind of see protest as a battle, and that it's like a quasi-militarist thing where their strategy is to engage with the police and have a fight with the police and people get injured or there are arrests. This is not successful protest. If you look at history, these short, sharp, kind of militaristic marches end badly, and they're the quickest thing to turn a society against a protest movement. And they're also, it's a very bad tactic because in every major protest event these days, there are provocateurs. They've been well established and well documented. We had reports of them from citizen journalists in Toronto during the G20, in Vancouver, in Pittsburgh, in Greece. They're called the known unknowns. When you have a short, sharp, violent march that ends in conflict, it gives absolute cover for agents provocateurs to create havoc. And this is an excuse for police brutality, and it turns the headlines against the movement immediately. Bad idea. That's why your goal is always to keep everything as peaceful as possible, so that provocateurs can't do their work. If someone starts to sort of set things on fire, it's not your guy, right? And also because history shows that's much, much more effective. So what does it mean to peacefully disrupt business as usual? The business as usual that's most effective to disrupt is traffic and commerce, okay? So ideally, that's why I keep saying to protesters, don't stand, don't march if you can avoid it. Sit or live somewhere. Like, if you think about the civil rights movement, some of the most effective protest was people sitting on stools in segregated coffee shops, and they just sat there in violation of illegal permits, unethical permits that segregated the races, while people poured things on their heads, right? That's the peaceful disruption of business as usual. In Estonia, one of the most effective protests ever, which in a matter of months brought the Soviet Union's occupation to its knees nonviolently, people parked their cars up and down the major highway that connected three nations, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and they just parked their cars and stood there with arms linked, singing, and nothing could pass. So that's a really brilliant example of peacefully disrupting business as usual. That's your goal. And I can't stress enough, what goes with this is don't use violent language. Try not to use like militaristic chants. Like I saw a picture today in the USA Today that said, class warfare is next, is the big sign that they zeroed in on. Not good language. Don't reference warfare. Don't reference, hatred, militarism, violence, threats. A couple of reasons for this. It's off-putting. It's scary to people with families and children. It turns people against you, but also you can then be arrested for incitement to riot, among other things. And also there's an ethical reason, which is you want the most effective protests. People are not engaged in a short, sharp action, but a strategy that is long-term. It takes, you're digging in for the long haul, months or years. The great protests took. Not usually more than 2 or 3 years, but people weren't thinking, oh, I'm going to have a big fight between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and then that'll look cool on my Facebook page. They were thinking, I'm going to live, in Zuccotti Park through the winter and into the spring, or I'm going to march, through the South, and I'm going to go down on buses. I'm going to be there month after month after month. Those are the effective protests, months and years, not a short, sharp shock. So the second important thing after being peaceful, and by the way, with peacefulness comes no property destruction. Because again, if you're not destroying property, then the guy who starts destroying property, you know exactly who he is. There's something else. People complain about the mess from your protest. Be like the protesters in Tahrir Square and bring your own, great visual. Bring your own mops and brooms and, clean up the neighborhood. Be nice to the police, instead of harassing the police or saying pig. It's not their fault for the most part. They're following orders, as in any fascistic society, they're following orders. Reach out to them. Tell your followers to respect what the police are doing. Don't make their job harder. Ideally, liaise with them. The opposition wins when they cast you as unreasonable, right? Bake them cookies, right? I mean, the most effective thing you can do is model leadership. Model that you are the kinds of people who are better stewards of society than the thieves on Wall Street or whoever it is you're protesting. So number 2, after being peaceful, is sign up your lawyers. Very, very important. You need to reach out to your local CLU. There's an ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, but there are also local branches. You also need to reach out to the National Lawyers Guild. These are your best friends, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. They are your lawyers. They can find you a lawyer. They can represent you. The National Lawyers Guild is the number you should memorize for when you're arrested. Don't put it in your cell phone because they take your cell phone away. Know it by heart. And you shouldn't just call on them. What you have to do is raise money to donate to them. Right now, they need to be hiring staff. They need to be like quadrupling and quintupling their staff of lawyers so that they can represent all the people who are going to be arrested in the next few months if there's successful, peaceful, disruptive protest. Something else I want to say about the nature of disruption and arrests is, Bloomberg has recently tried to make the case, and in city they're going to try to discourage, for instance, OWS protesters this way. Oh, you're disrupting the life of the city. You're causing trouble. There's noise. I want to remind people that there is no absolute right in a democracy for freedom from disruption from First Amendment activities of your fellow citizens. It doesn't exist. It's a fake frame for argument, so don't buy into it. The First Amendment does give you an absolute right to engage in freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. But disruption follows from that. Peaceful disruption follows from that. And Dr. King said that peaceful disruption is good. Disruption of business as usual is good because it brings into light conflicts and injustices that were suppressed, and it brings them to light to be dealt with. So don't let harassment or scolding from municipalities, from mayors, from the media, telling you you're being disruptive, deter you. It's your First Amendment obligation to be disruptive, but you must always maintain the high road by being peaceful and disciplined. All right. So number 3 is, this is going to sound crazy, but it's true. Make the protest happy. And what I mean is, joyful, life-affirming, positive. The protests that burn out really quickly are fueled on anger. I'm not saying there are not plenty of reasons to be angry, but the ones that really change the world, involve an element of joy and creativity and positive energy that draws people. This, again, my favorite quote is Emma Goldman's, "If I can't dance, it's not my revolution." Instead of militaristic chanting, which wears people out, frankly, after 1 or 2 hours, whose streets are streets? I could do that for like an hour and 15 minutes, and then I'm done. I want to go home and take a bath, But you can sing spirituals, as the civil rights movement did, for months. You can play folk music for months, as the anti-war movement did. So I would advise all protesters to bring songbooks, create a movement songbook, bring musical instruments, invite bands, invite performers, turn it into a gathering that will restore and boost your energy rather than burning you out, and that will draw people, that'll be a cool place to be.
Do you have any comments on the drum circles? There's been a lot of protests against the...
Thank you. So the question arises, what about the drum circles? I understand that there are people beating drums that are creating what feels like a disruption to other people. I don't think it's a great idea to create a sound that is so dominating to everyone else. What you want to model is a peaceful civil society in your little microcosm. So, I would say, let the drum circle go for 2 hours, let the folk singers come for 2 hours, let there be story time for the kids for 2 hours. This is the kind of thing you want to do. But, look at Estonia again. Estonia, it's called the Singing Revolution, and all they did was 2 brave people in a giant, youth retreat stood up and started to sing the forbidden Estonian national anthem, in the face of, Soviet tanks. And this was so amazing, everyone else started to sing it. And then hundreds of thousands of people were gathering and singing the Estonian national anthem. And then the whole damn country was singing it in public places where they weren't supposed to be. And this allowed them to surround, ultimately, the national radio and television tower and singing. And not a single, Soviet tank dared to breach this deep, deep wall of people standing peacefully singing. So it's very powerful when you choose joy and music. A tiny thing, number 4, don't cover your faces. Masks are a very bad idea for a lot of reasons, but one reason is that agents provocateurs love masks because they can hide their own faces while they do damage. Related to this is also number 4 is citizens should use their video cameras and their still cameras religiously, and they should take their own role seriously as citizen reporters. Like, every member of a protest has to also think of him or herself as a journalist. And what this means is religiously document what's happening. I do think the whole world is watching is a very effective chant when there's police brutality. Document it, and you need to create a website where violent or abusive police are photographed and logged, and the details of what happens, what follow-up happens, are made public, and this also needs to be made available to the press. So they're surveilling you, you surveil them. Okay, number 5. I talked about stopping traffic. A major goal of an effective protest movement is the reclamation of public space. Another effective way to do this is linking arms, or very effective is being seated and linking arms. Again, so that there's no question of the police being able to say, well, you resisted arrest. Also, protesters should always be mindful of the visuals that they're creating. It is theater to some extent, and the really great protesters who are effective understood that it was theater. So it's much more powerful to have a visual of people seated and not resisting being dragged away than people engaged in a yelling conflict with cops being arrested. Leading into that, what you always want to do in addition to stopping traffic or disrupting commerce peacefully is always having your goal to be the reclamation of public space. So I spoke earlier about permits keeping us out of public spaces. Right now there's an important conversation going on about, well, what is public space? Private entities get to lease this park, or give these tennis lessons to rich kids, and we can't protest in our own tax-supported public spaces. In America and throughout the world, we have to reclaim our public spaces. That's where democracy lives. So when you stop traffic or protest without a permit, please subsidize your National Lawyers Guild to bring that case to your local municipality, to have that fight, to reclaim that public space, okay? Because you don't just need it for this protest, you need it for the future. It's our town hall. I mean, if people couldn't have assembled in Astor Place or on the Mall in the 60s or in the 90s, there would have been no labor movement, there would have been no civil rights movement. We need those public spaces back, and we need to have those court fights. Number 6 goes further into visuals. You always need to think like, TV or film producers and actors, as well as citizen journalists. What I mean is, a lot of protesters complain that the mainstream media doesn't cover their protest. But frankly, there are things that protesters need to know about what makes it easier for the mainstream media to cover a protest. And one of the things that makes it easier are arresting visuals. You can heighten the likelihood that your protest is going to be on the cover of your local newspaper or national newspaper, the evening news, by using color to unify the scene. Right now, it's really hard to do a big panorama. It's hard to justify the real estate, even for a sympathetic editor, because people are dressed in a lot of motley ways or individualistic ways, and that's great for daily life. You don't have to wear a uniform in daily life. But if you really want to help editors help get the word out about your protest, choose a color. And you don't have to dress in uniforms, but everyone wear that color to the event, so that what you get is a sea of the same color. I would say red, white, and blue, in America, because for obvious reasons, but I don't want to dictate. But choose a color, and then what the photographer will have to do is take a wide-angle shot showing a mass, hundreds and hundreds, rather than the 2 or 3 people that he or she is more likely to take if people are not wearing a single color. So the other beautiful thing that having a color associated with the movement does, and this happened in Iran, suddenly everyone was wearing green, you remember, after that young woman was shot in Iran. If you have a color that is associated with the movement, people can show their support for that movement. Not everybody can, for personal reasons or political reasons, show up with you in your square and your rally. But many people, if you have a color, can wear that color to work, wear that color to their kids' football game, wear that color when they speak to Congress, and they can non-verbally signal that they're a supporter. So it is a way for citizens to have a conversation in support of you, if they can signal non-verbally with color. Visuals. I want to talk about dressing up for protest. I know this sounds kind of weird in a contemporary context where almost no one dresses up at all, but the civil rights movement was so visual, and it got covered on the covers of Life magazine and major media from the beginning, not because everyone liked poor black people at that time who were causing disruption, but because of the power of the visuals. What were they doing? They were always dressed in their Sunday best. If you think back to the civil rights movement, it was people wearing suits and dresses and hats, and little girls in little white dresses, pigtails, just dressed with such kind of reverence for the act of expressing their First Amendment rights, or going to vote. And the same thing with the students. I believe that SNCC, or leftist student sympathizers who would go from New York or whatever to go march with the civil rights movement, they would arrive looking really scruffy because that was the style, and they were told, put on a tie, put on a jacket, shave. These are not trivial things. If you dress up for the First Amendment, it doesn't just, and I'm not saying every minute, I mean, you're out there in the rain, it's not practical every minute, but for key marches or key events or key rallies, dress up, because again, it's a much more powerful visual, makes it much harder to beat, to have the police beat the shit out of you. And it makes them look much worse when they do. And it's reassuring it makes it harder for your opposition to say, these are rabble, they're drug addicts, they just want to masturbate in public or poop in public or whatever, right? You're in a suit, you're in a dress, you're wearing stockings, right? And it also does something inexplicable. You know, when people show reverence for the First Amendment or for the right to vote or for democracy, something changes that is, I would say, spiritual, but, you know, leaving that aside, there's an inexplicable change that takes place. If you're in the United States, bring the American flag, many, many American flags. If you're in the military, wear your uniform. You know, if you're a mom, you know, wear t-shirts saying, I'm an American mom. I mean, the visual of a cop, you know, bloodying the head of someone who's been carrying the American flag, right, or is in a military uniform, is so powerful. That flag will protect you, right, and it'll also help, message that these values are American values, they're mainstream values, that you're standing up for this great tradition. But literally, it'll help keep you safe. You don't want to be the first cop to shoot the rubber bullet at the young woman holding the Stars and Stripes. It's not a good picture on the front page of the New York Times. So the seventh thing is build infrastructure. Super important. You know, people are really misunderstanding the power of the OWS movement because, you know, the press keeps saying there's no agenda, there's no agenda. Eventually, there needs to be an agenda, and we can get to that in subsequent webinars, in my opinion. But in the meantime, what's really critical about what's happening out there is that infrastructure is being built and relationships are being built. And that's so important because for 2 decades, Americans have been, but people around the world, have been encouraged to just stay home, be on their computers, go to the mall, don't engage face-to-face, leave it with the experts, right? So the most empowering thing that's happening is people are out there saying, what do you do? What's your group? What's your interest? What are your skills? Oh, let's put out a newsletter. Right? This is so critical. So the best thing that you could do with this infrastructure is start an email list locally, sync it nationally, let the media know day by day, month by month, how it's growing, right? And then with that email list, the second most important thing, well, actually, it's the second thing, but it is the most important thing after you've built the email list infrastructure, is to register voters. And because the people making the decisions right now that you're all protesting really don't care about you if, A, they think you're all Democrats and not swing voters because they assume that they're not going to get that vote anyway, and it doesn't matter. Or rather, Obama assumes he has your vote, and the opposition assumes they'll never get your vote. So the only way you make a difference to those people is by either saying you're swing voters or registering votes, showing that you've registered votes, and they totally don't care about you if you're not registered to vote. It's like too fucking bad what you care about. You're not registered to vote. I don't need to listen to you at all. But if you do one really simple thing, it's not sexy, it's not glamorous, but it is game-changing. You'll have more power than all the people that you're fighting. And this is the simple thing. And I got this straight from Curtis Ellis, who informed me straight from the Hill. If you register only 30, as few as 30, but between 30 and 100 voters in your congressional district, and you make an appointment and you go to your representative's district office and you show them that list of 3,200 registered voters, and you say, we will work to re-elect your guy or girl during the congressional elections and during the 4-year elections if you do what we say, and we will work to unseat you if you don't, right? And this is what we will do to get out the vote for you if you do what we say, and be specific. We'll do a fundraiser, grassroots, we'll put out signs, we'll have, household events and invite all our friends. These seem like tiny things, but they make a giant difference. People win or lose congressional seats by tiny, like a dozen votes, right? Makes a huge difference if you can say this. Or if you say, we'll do everything we can to unseat your guy or girl if you don't do these things. Then straight from the Hill, that gives you the power that it levels out or starts to tip the balance of power for you and your group against the lobbyists. Because as much as they need the lobbyists' money to get reelected, and they don't need that much money to get reelected, is the great secret of American politics, they, every 2 years, every 4 years, need those votes even more. So, and it's, again, it's the congressional elections that no one pays attention to that are so critical. So if all your organization does is, or your movement does, is register voters in that way, create those lists, and send representatives to go to the district offices of your congressional representatives and say, we want, these laws passed, these laws not passed. We'll get out the vote in these ways if you agree. We'll unseat you in these ways if you don't agree. You're a force, and you're national. So if you do this state by state, you don't even need a national agenda out of your General Assembly. You can push for what you care about state by state. And it doesn't even have to be one static agenda. You can decide month by month what it is you care about. You can decide year by year what it is you care about. But if all you did was that, and it seems so little, but it's so big, in 2 years you would have the power to stop the wars if you wanted to stop the wars. You would have the power to tax corporations if you wanted to tax corporations. You would have the power to stop, roll back the Patriot Act, which I think is number one, because without that, you're all going to be swept up, like me, to Guantanamo, sooner or later. You could roll back the Patriot Act. You could create a jobs bill. You could audit the Fed. You could, whatever it is in your agenda, invest money in the schools. You could do it because you would have, in one election cycle, more power than lobbyists and special interests who are buying the Congress people right now in our system. All right. Number 9 is be your own media. Don't depend on mainstream media to cover you because they're owned by General Electric, and General Electric likes things the way they are. They like owning their Congress people and legislature. They don't want your involvement. So don't keep looking to mainstream media, and increasingly people are not, which is great, but forget about it. They're not going to cover you properly. Make your own media by blogging, sending op-eds directly to op-ed editors, and you can find out who they are by calling the switchboards or what the website is to send it to, a web address, calling the switchboards at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times. Those are the big ones. You should send video footage. TV producers continually need clips that are dramatic, and you should call your local NBC, CBS, ABC affiliate, find out who the producer is who covers the local news, send her or him video clips, and identify yourself, give a contact number, don't make anything up, right? If you're citizen reporters, you have to stick to the facts. Send those video clips, explain, Journalism 101, who, what, where, why, how. Who is it in the image? What's happening? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? Okay? And continually do that. Then you'll be a source, right? There are other ways you can be your own media. You can also send still photographs, and you can also create your own documentaries, which are really important. And I would recommend that you create a website where you play, continual documentary footage of the movement that you're creating, because you can't rely on YouTube now. It's being bowdlerized by the U.S. government. So I would also put out a request to technicians and to media people. It can't be affiliated media people because they're not allowed to engage in partisan politics, but freelancers can come and do more detailed one-to-ones tailored to that local media environment, giving you contact names and contact information for who the editors are who cover this beat, who the producers are who would need the footage, and then you would have those relationships. And the next webinar I'll do will be on media, creating your own media, how to do media. But that's just a very early heads up about be your own media. And the last thing I want to say, which is a hallmark of all successful protest movements, is that you do need to have spokespeople. And I know that the beauty of Occupy Wall Street at this point is that no one's a spokesperson. And there's tactical benefit to that because, historically when there have been spokespeople, a COINTELPRO tactic is to kill off or smear or compromise the spokespeople. But if you can create a circular system of revolving spokespeople, so that it's a short term, maybe 3 months at a time, or maybe have dozens and dozens of spokespeople. In politics, on national political campaigns, these are called surrogates. And in a way, it's good to use that word rather than spokesperson, because you're a surrogate for the movement. You're not the movement. You're speaking for the movement. You're speaking on behalf of it. You're not running it, right? You're just a citizen. That you've been trained with these talking points, and in my next webinar, I'll teach you how to do talking points. But you definitely want to tap people who are good communicators, especially if they're, retired people, working people, nurses, teachers, truckers, homemakers, small business people, conservatives, military people, police officers, retired police officers, military, retired military. You want the face of the movement to be everybody's face, but not nobody's face, right? So you can do that by identifying dozens and dozens and dozens of ordinary citizens who can learn, 3 sound bites and go out there to raise awareness and to be on message. So that's my brief overview of the hallmarks of a successful protest movement. I hope that that's helpful. Use whatever is useful to you, disregard anything that is not useful, but please, 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 I beg you, it's the potential of this movement and what's happening around the world is so great. Please stay nonviolent. Please stay peaceful, disciplined, eyes on the prize. It's a greater glory in the long run than militaristic engagement. It's so important, and it's also, again, on some weird, I would say spiritual, but other people may have other explanations, on some weird, inexplicable level, it is transformative what happens when millions of people non-violently do the right thing. Good luck.